Okay, good morning, everybody. Hope y'all had a good weekend. Finally, I feel like it's starting to be springtime. Okay, so we left off Friday about halfway through this chapter. We want to start thinking some details about B cells, antibody production, all sorts of activity that we could be thinking about with handfuls of different types of immunoglobulins. We showed the table that talked about the 5 classes of antibodies or immunoglobulins. And one of those is a little bit different. The immunoglobulin IgD. Let me see if this guy's going to work. Oh, hang on. Oh, now it's just clicking. Okay, that's fine. So IgD is this guy right here. All right. It is a cell receptor on B cells. And we will see in a second some details about it. But these immunoglobulins are specific to one epitope, and they are on the B cell that then is doing some surveillance, looking for that specific signature. If it sees it, it links up and can stimulate the production of antibodies from within its cell. And they start producing whatever B cell stimulated against this, IgG or IgM, potentially we might think about IgE if we are talking an allergic type of a response, but typically IgG and IgM are the immunoglobulins that these B cells would start manufacturing in response to something that they've bumped into. All right. IgA, the secretory antibodies, a little bit different with those mechanisms, but similarly, upon stimulation, the B cells could start secreting IgA molecules in response to that, but it would be different areas of the body where we would be thinking about it more so. All right. So this image, there are a couple of ways that the B cells do their surveillance and are stimulated to start producing antibodies. And I mentioned last time, when we think about immune responses, all sorts of different potentials with different types of cells coming in and responding. And we think about antibody mediated and cell mediated responses. And we talk about them kind of separate, but deep down, we think about them working together. All right. But when it comes to the B cells and their ability to produce antibodies, that's kind of the same idea. And you want to have an opportunity for these B cells to get stimulated and secrete antibodies in a couple of different ways to kind of maximize their potentials. All right. So we'll talk about how a B cell can get stimulated to produce these IgDs or other immunoglobulins. Truly, we'll go through some details with that in a minute. All right. What's not shown here, and that's what we're going to go through, is some step that stimulates these B cells in the first place. All right. Once they've been told what's up, the IgD, those B cell receptors, they are primed to recognize those specific types of antigens. All right. And there's all sorts of different things that might stimulate those responses. That would lend to a boatload of different B cells, all having on their specific cell one piece of that puzzle. And you are in turn looking for as many pieces as you potentially could. When bumping into it, as we see here with this bacterial cell, we've got the ability to recognize some of these specific antigens, one little epitope for this respective B cell. Another B cell may see some other piece of this puzzle, and both of which would be stimulated to start secreting antibodies, as we see in this next bump over. These are IgM antibodies, all right? The first ones that truly start being released in an immune response, and then we see IgGs, right? So these guys are stimulated by what our B cell initially bumped into, but technically it was primed previously, all right? So a T lymphocyte has been shown by a macrophage these specific pieces of that bacterium, and in turn, numerous T cells shown all of these different pieces have told various B cells what's up. And now their B cell receptors are stimulated to go out and seek that stuff out, right? And once they do, they can start secreting these immunoglobulins. And as they get activated, we would say this is a plasma cell. It's an antibody secreting factory. It's been stimulated by detecting something, and in turn causes it to proliferate and start pumping out more of these antibodies, hoping to link up to as many antigens, causing agglutination reactions, or potentially stimulating complement proteins to come in and start drilling holes in these molecules or these bacteria, whatever it might be, to try to do the job of destroying, really, right? There's other things that we could also be examining, and we're glossing over some of this, but these B cells are also stimulated through this interaction to start releasing chemical mediators, more cytokines, to stimulate more cells to come in and start dealing with this stuff as well, all right? So we get all sorts of interactions. So this first image that we're looking at is T cell independent B cell activation, where it doesn't need that to occur, but deep down, it's already technically been primed, all right? Some other interaction is required to activate that in the first place, all right? That's okay though. This is a way that we stimulate all sorts of antibody production. We can use this to think about the stimulation of those IgD immunoglobulins on the surface of the B cell. And we can also think about the production of antibodies, all right, upon this stimulation. So that lends to all sorts of humoral immunity, antibody mediated immunity, all right? So this activity is T cell dependent, all right? We've got to have our little green guy over here is a T helper cell, and it's going to do some communicating, all right? So in this circumstance, we've got a B cell. It's linked up with this bacterium, with its respective antigen on that bacterium, and it is going to do a little show and tell on this MHC2 molecule. It's showing a fragment that it's bound with, and that T cell in turn can turn to others and start interacting, all right? Showing these pieces to different B cells, stimulating their differentiation. There's other activity with these T cells, or maybe it's a macrophage or dendritic cell that bumps into them and shows similar idea. The dendritic cells, the macrophages, and these B cells have MHC2 molecules on their surfaces, and all three of those are responsible for antigen presentation, for showing these pieces of the bad guys to the T cells to stimulate those T cells to tell other cells, right? It's a lot of telling, right? Once these B cells upon stimulation by these T cells, so we're looking at other ones, we could see them differentiating, some of them becoming memory cells, waiting, and this becomes super important when we think about immunity, when we think about the ability to respond to something later on, either as a result of previous exposure or thinking vaccinations that lend to the ability to see these things later on, right? So memory cells are important for some protective immunity, and the plasma cells, well, these are important right in that instance of this infection. They are stimulated to just start flooding the body with massive amounts of antibody, and maybe upon the second exposure of that pathogen, those memory cells are what's targeted to start differentiating into these plasma cells, and we see immune responses much more rapid upon that second exposure. We showed an image of that in the first bit of this chapter, and we're going to see another picture with it here in just a couple slides that really goes a little deeper, showing different classes of antibodies as we progress through, right? So a lot of different activity, and in these circumstances, it also depends on the types of helper cells that we're looking at, right? We've talked about the T helper 1s and T helper 2s, and the T helper 2 cells are the ones that are really doing this stuff, thinking about antibody types of responses, and the others, the helper 1s, are thinking more cell-mediated responses, not stimulating the B cells in the same way. I said a couple slides, it's this slide. It was the next one. So similar, but a little bit different as our starting figure. And this provides quite a bit more detail as we're really looking at what's happening with different types of antibodies, right? So we do have on our x-axis a time frame, right? And we go about a month, and we've got a little jig-jag in here, meaning a lapse in time, right? We could be looking at, months or years potentially after this first exposure before the second exposure shows up, right? Truly depends on the circumstances. And that's, so we're not just looking at 40 days or whatever, all right? So we could measure, and there are a handful of mechanisms that allow us to measure antibody in a patient's serum. So taking some blood, removing the red cells and the plasma, the fluid left behind, that harbors antibodies. The serum has these protein molecules within there that we could potentially detect. We think about possibly donating plasma, and doing that, truly, they're trying to extract antibodies, and they do some purification and separate different types of antibodies out of that plasma for various diseases that they in turn can use to treat, right? We'll talk about a little bit of that in a bit, right? So there's a couple of ways we might think about being able to actually evaluate how much we're looking at. And some of these immunodiagnostic assays give us abilities to measure levels of antibodies or even antigens in a sample that can give us some clues as to maybe the progression of disease or the activity of the immune response. Are we actually producing measurable amounts of antibody or not, right? Thinking, potentially going into healthcare situations, you get all sorts of different vaccinations, and hepatitis is one of them that you get vaccinated against, and then they take some blood and do a titer after you've had 2 or 3 shots. I don't remember which it is. After you've had those, they take some blood, do a titer, and see, what are your antibody levels? And potentially not quite sufficient enough, and they give you another shot, right? Or maybe you're not really responding favorably at all. And then you have to kind of wonder, should this be something that I really want to do, right? If I'm not really mounting a response like I should, maybe something else could be in my cards, right? I don't know. So we could see the two types of antibodies, the IgM and IgG. And I mentioned a second ago, IgM is our first, and then we see IgG following shortly after, all right? Both of which being really kind of pumped out in the hopes that we're secreting enough of these proteins into our circulation to do this surveillance after we've recognized whatever it is as being foreign, all right? So our initial exposure takes a couple weeks for our body to detect, to show, and start responding. We need macrophages to come in. We need them to gobble up these bacteria and present on their surface the bad guys. Those macrophages, once they become these antigen-presenting cells, show T cells. And those T cells have to have time to bump into the proper B cell that they can communicate with and say, look what I've found, right? That B cell in turn then starts being stimulated by the T cells, starts secreting these antibodies, right? And we start off with the IgMs. Takes about 2 weeks for this to kind of start to peak with the IgM response, right? And as it's starting to decline, IgG is taken off, and it kind of crosses over at the decline of IgM. We're just starting to really take over. And a couple weeks later, maybe 3 weeks after the initial exposure, give or take a little bit, we see a peak in the IgG response. These antibodies, a little slower to be stimulated, but their activity is greater. We've got more production with them, and it lasts a bit longer than the IgM, all right? And then it starts to drop off a few weeks after we've peaked, all right? Once that happens, and we show these guys really kind of coming down to about the same low level as we've started with right here, but technically we're up a little bit. There's some memory cells that have been generated with this, and we should be a little bit higher than right here, which should be like a 0. We didn't have any antibody at this primary exposure, but now we do, and we would have some memory cells. So we should be a little bit higher than we are right here, all right? Upon the next exposure, this happens, the response, a lot quicker. So instead of needing to go 2 weeks or so, now we're maybe 4 or 5 days, maybe a little bit more than that, to see our peak in an IgM response. We still need to have some activity, right? And we still see some other stuff like the macrophages doing stuff, but there are B cells with those receptors that have been primed to see this, right? And so as they happen upon them, it's stimulating the response much more rapidly, right? And the IgG is really the critical player when we think about a lot of the immunity in the first place. Even though IgM is our first player, IgG is the one that's really doing a lot of the work. So at this point, IgG is kicked into gear at the same time as IgM because there's memory cells with both of them. And IgG starts to increase, crossing over a lot higher up in the IgM decline than we were before, right? So both of these molecules doing some quite a bit of surveillance. As IgM starts to decline, IgG surpasses it considerably, peaking and staying elevated for weeks as it starts to decline. And these levels are really what we think about more so with some of this protective immunity and more memory cells that would be IgG. There's still going to be some IgM. And then we could progress further out with another little jig jag in there and go later on and have a third exposure and see a similar sort of response like this as we progress through. All right. Truly kind of depends on some of these circumstances as far as the type of antigen, how good of a response it truly can stimulate as far as levels of protective immunity. Sometimes we think about vaccinations conferring lifelong immunity, and other times needing booster shots. Really just depends on some of those circumstances. All right. One thing that we really don't go into great detail with in here, really kind of something that's more focused in really like in an immunology class. But one thing I think is kind of important to think about the littlest bit and not go into great detail. There are potentials for these B cells as they have been shown what's going on and they start responding. They would initially, typically, we think about the initial things being released as IgM molecules or immunoglobulins. Some of those same B cells can differentiate and change antigenic shifts or shifting the antibody, not antigenic shift, sorry, shifting the antibodies that they are stimulated to secrete and transition from pumping out IgMs to pumping out IgGs. And in these circumstances, that epitope that we've been stimulated to seek out, that's not changing in this B cell, but the type of antibody is. So it's still looking for the same piece of the puzzle. It's just a different type of antibody that's doing it. And typically, this stuff, IgM to IgG, that stuff, we would hope is occurring. Sometimes we do it a little bit differently. And instead of shifting over to the IgG, IgE is the one that starts getting stimulated to be produced. Some of us, it happens in, and some of us, it doesn't. And if you have allergies, it's happening in you. And when that happens, we're stimulated to see something like a crazy pollen grain, and we see that as foreign, and we start thinking we should mount a response, and then we shift over and start producing IgE that says, oh, we can do something about it. And that stimulates your mast cells and basophils to start dumping histamine, and now you feel the ill effects of those allergens. If you don't shift over and produce the IgE, we don't think about being stimulated to produce an allergic response in the first place. So it really just depends on what's happening and what's going on in these B cells. Are they transitioning to something that might not be what you truly want going on? So that could also, as we look at this with an antigen exposure, we could think about this like an allergic response and seeing something like this, but instead of our IgG or maybe IgG to IgE, we would see another immunoglobulin in this mix. And it's that second dose or second exposure that really would mount a peak with the IgE and recognizing the allergy. All right. It takes more than one shot for an allergy to truly start happening. You need an initial and then a second exposure. All right. So there's a lot of different ways that we can think about getting immunity, being able to have these antibodies. All right. So we can think about naturally and artificially acquired. We can also think about a passive and an active type of response. All right. Both passive and active can be natural or artificial. All right. So 4 different ways, and it really just depends on some of these circumstances. All right. So we'll talk passive first. With passive immunity, we could think about antibodies passed to that child, either while it's still inside the womb, crossing through the placenta. We said IgG immunoglobulins can cross the placenta, conferring a little bit of immunity to that child as it hatches out into the world. Also, through breast milk, there's antibodies that are able to be transferred. We think about IgA molecules, immunoglobulins secreted in the breast milk, but IgG is also a potential conferring some immunity to that child, right? So they get some while they're still cooking up, crossing the placenta, and then they get other antibodies through breastfeeding, right? There's all sorts of good nutrients in breast milk, and in turn, truly advisable to think about breastfeeding if you truly can, right? So formula isn't giving them any sort of immunity that way, right? The artificial acquired passive immunity, this would be, like I mentioned, the plasma donation, right? So getting an injection of somebody else's antibodies, right? So it's not giving you an immunization. Your body's not producing these antibodies. You're just getting antibodies into your circulation, and they're going to persist for a bit, but ultimately not be lifelong. There's not memory cells that are in there. It's just those proteins, right? And so it could be from some person. It also might be from an animal. There are some potentials with some of this where maybe a horse, maybe something else, but horses were pretty good at some antibody production. And sometimes we think about some antivenoms being generated in a horse. They are very large and in turn, huge volumes of blood. They can produce massive amounts of antibodies. And you think about someone like us being able to go in and donate a unit of blood. And a horse can, I don't know the details, but I know they can donate more than that, right? So you can get more from the individual. I'm talking a human, right? There are some potentials with that, and truly, we would hope that the bulk of this stuff will be coming from people, right? There are some potentials with this passive immunization of horse serum for a situation called serum sickness, where we mount a response against these foreign proteins coming from a different animal, right? So, and that's also something that typically takes, you'd have repeated exposures to these passive immunizations to mount these ill effects, the serum sickness. It's not just the first shot of that gets you, all right? So the active mechanisms naturally acquired would be getting sick, whatever it is, and recovering. That should give some naturally acquired active immunity. We've seen it, we've dealt with it, we've produced antibodies and some memory cells. Whether or not that type of active immunity is lifelong or not is hard to say, all right? Truly depends on the situation. They imagine that chickenpox, contracting chickenpox confers immunity. And you don't get chickenpox more than once, right? However, the virus does go dormant on your nerve cells and can flare up later in life as shingles. So it kind of makes you wonder, right? Is there anything immunity-wise that starts to decline that causes that to flare up or not? Or is it nothing to really do with that? You can get vaccinated later in life if you've had chickenpox to prevent shingles. And there's vaccination against chickenpox to prevent that in the first place, right? But other stuff, maybe, maybe not, right? You know, the common cold, there's hundreds of different types of cold viruses, all sorts of different types of viruses that can cause common cold with symptoms that are super, super similar. But every single strain of virus that has plagued us and given us a cold, we develop immunity against. And in turn, you don't get the same cold because you've got immunity against that. It's always somebody different, but symptoms pretty much the same, right? So that's naturally acquired active immunity. And then the last bit over here is a vaccination. So this is artificially acquired, but it's active immunity. So you're getting a piece of that puzzle that stimulates the immune response pretty much the same way as this guy, right? As if you actually had the infection, but you didn't, all right? And in some instances, you feel a little bit under the weather with something like this, and that might be part of that immune response, seeing a fragment that stimulates a little bit of ill effect, but nothing like if you truly had the illness in the first place, all right? And definitely some of the vaccines we think about, the diseases that they are preventing, super severe, and something that you would be much happier just having a fraction and not the full-blown illness. So this is artificially acquired, but it's active because we do produce the antibodies and the memory cells with the hopes that it gives us protection, all right? That's the hope. So as far as vaccination goes, we just have a couple of slides left with this chapter. There's all sorts of really kind of interesting and also sort of disturbing details about some of these practices. Variolation was a idea to prevent smallpox, where you would take the scabs from a person with smallpox and dry them and grind them up and then blow them up the nostril of someone uninfected with the hopes that you're going to prevent them from developing smallpox. And sort of effective, right? You also had opportunities to infect some people with some smallpox and they contracted it, right? There's definitely some issues with that, all right? There were all sorts of things. You wanted these pustules to definitely be dry, sometimes heating them the littlest bit maybe helped to make it so that it was more inactive, if you will, and wouldn't cause the actual disease progression, or maybe not quite as much, all right? Regardless, right? This was some of the first ideas of really being able to vaccinate, although we're not really thinking vaccination at this point, variolation, but like what we think of today, like vaccination. You're getting a little bit of something to stimulate this response, right? And so this was something in the Far East that where we see it originating as we look at this woodcut showing some of this practice, but it ultimately was brought to Europe. Lady Montague, I believe the story goes, witnessed some of these practices. Everyone's terrified of smallpox. And in turn sees this stuff happening and brings it back to Europe and basically introduces that, right? And we see this kind of progressing a little bit at least, all right? The vaccination, we give credit to Edward Jenner for coming up with the idea of actually this inoculating something into you. So there's all sorts of stories about this guy, all right? Here we can see a different type of pox virus, something that still looks pretty bad, all right? But cowpox that we're looking at here is much less virulent. The potential for it to cause super serious disease in people, not so much, all right? It's still bad, all right? I would think you still probably wouldn't be so happy to contract it, but it's not something that you think of as really being a fatal type of infection. So Jenner observed that the milkmaids, the ladies who were milking the cows, oftentimes they were coming in contact with cows that had some of these pox lesions on them. Cowpox, as the name implies, is something that we would think about in cattle, all right? So as these girls are milking the cows, they're coming in contact with some of these lesions, and in turn, they develop some cowpox. And he sees that these girls are getting these pox lesions, but they don't seem to get smallpox. So it makes him wonder, what's going on with this, right? Could this potentially be protecting them against smallpox? Maybe the cowpox and smallpox are kind of close, and the immune response could be sufficient that it could be some protection against it, right? Maybe the proteins are similar that we're producing antibodies against, right? And preventing that infection. It's not the same idea as this, but it's pretty stinking close, all right? So he wants to collect some of the pustules from the cowpox, and he wants to inoculate that, so inject it into a person to see. And that's what he ultimately sets out to do, all right? I have heard all sorts of different things, all right? Initially, what I heard was that he used his son and inoculated him with some cowpox, and then later exposed him to smallpox to see if it truly worked. That seems kind of terrifying, and it seems like a pretty bad dad, right? You'd think maybe, that seems like some child abuse. You ought to get locked up for that. But then I learned a little more about it, and now I'm not, that seems bad. This is like 10 times worse, I imagine, all right? Why use your own kid when you could just go down the street to the orphanage and you could pick yourself up a kid and you could do your experiments, and if they die, who cares, right? Doesn't really matter, right? It's like you could just go get your own little lab rat, right? But it's a little kid, right? So that's the story I've heard, and I think that's probably more accurate. So he went and got himself a boy from the orphanage, and he inoculated him with some cowpox. And after a couple of weeks or a month, whatever it was, a little bit of time, then he exposed him to smallpox. Fortunately, he didn't develop smallpox, right? And in turn, there we get our vaccination. Cowpox is called vaccinia, and vaccination from that, right? Kind of crazy, kind of disturbing, right? And as I said, he should have been locked up thinking that he did that to his own kid. I think he really should have for going to the orphanage and thinking that he has saved someone only to, ultimately use him as a laboratory animal. That seems a little bit more disturbing, all right? What happened after that? I don't know the details, all right? Hard to say, all right? I'm sure there's something out there, right? Okay. That's a little bit quick, but I think we will stop with that. We will pick up with chapter 19 on Wednesday. Questions or concerns? Okay, very well. Go enjoy the weather.